So yeah, I will then restart with this 2 or 3 motivating examples that I said they're non-input to state stable system, but still they're quite relevant systems, and they do exhibit some kind of robustness to exogenous disturbances. And definitely then we would like to try to understand what kind of robustness this could be. And there are at least a couple of alternative notions that one could think of. So the first one, the original definition of input to state stability, as you recall, it's something that needs to hold for all input disturbances. So it could be a possibility to try to impose an input restriction on the disturbances that you can apply to the system. So in particular, we could formulate a property of ISS with input restriction. So asking exactly the same type of inequality to hold for all t greater or equal than 0, all initial conditions, but only disturbances taking value in a ball of radius, maybe capital D bigger than 0, which is up to you, let's say, to choose. So that's input to state stability with input restriction. That's clearly quite useful, I would say, at least in the examples that I was talking about before. You would really see that the issue was really with large disturbances being the source of the problem, so able to essentially destabilize the system. So if you, for instance, take D to be smaller than the saturation, then there is good, than the saturation range, there's good hope that that system could be input to state stable. An alternative way instead, which does not let's say, sacrifice the fact that we're talking about arbitrary disturbances, is the so-called integral ISS. So what we do in integral ISS, we essentially replace the infinity norm of the disturbance with an integral term, the energy of the disturbance. For technical reasons, in fact, we also need to put an extra class K infinity function here to the left in the definition, because, well, if you invert this, okay, when you've got class K infinity functions, very beautiful thing is that they can be inverted, they're still class K infinity, so you could apply alpha minus 1 to this side and get a phi. You will get alpha minus 1 of the sum of two things. There are so-called weak triangular inequalities that allow you to then separate this into two class K infinity function, alpha minus 1 of 2 beta plus alpha minus 1 of twice this thing. So the first bit is still KL. The second part, now it's a class K infinity function applied to an integral. And of course, because of nonlinearity of these functions, the class K infinity function cannot really go inside. And so we really cannot, without loss of generality, assume that here we've got an identity, let's say, instead of alpha. And this is, so the formulation, if you had here the classical definition of ISS, of course, when you apply a class K infinity function in front of the infinity norm, that doesn't really change the nature of the property, because composition of two class K infinity functions is still the same. So the problem is that there is this integral here, and then we need to add this thing to make the notion truly invariant. Okay, but this is more like a technical detail, really. So we've got these two alternatives, and how can you then deal with them? So it turns out that for the first definition, really, is just input to state stability. So all we need to do is specialize essentially the formulation of the ISS Lyapunov function that we had before to this particular, to comply, let's say, with the input restriction. And so we again look at Lyapunov functions of the same form, positive, definite, radially unbounded. And we ask the same type of dissipation inequality of this form, so v dot less or equal minus alpha of x plus gamma of t. But what is the difference? That we only ask this for D which are sufficiently small. So only D less or equal than the bound capital D that we have a priori fixed. Whereas the property is still global with respect to states, of course. So we still have a global property, a global stability property, and some kind of robustness with respect to small disturbances, where small is quantified by this capital D, let's say. That's one thing. So the proof of this really follows basically along the same line as the proof of the ISS results. Different story for the second definition, because the second definition involves integrals on the right hand side. So notice that integrals, of course, when you've got here something, for instance, bounded, I don't know, D equal 1, for instance, is a bounded disturbance, but its integral is not a bounded quantity, unlike the infinity norm. So this thing can go all the way to infinity, despite the fact that you're applying a bounded input. So in particular, integral ISS does not, in fact, imply results of the type bounded input, bounded state, simply because here the energy of a bounded input is, in fact, an unbounded quantity, and so also your state can grow unbounded as a result of this inequality, is allowed to, at least in principle. And looking at ways to characterize this with Lyapunov functions, again, first of all, we need the Lyapunov function to be working for D equals 0 in the standard way. So for D equals 0, V dot has to be negative definite. So that's still something which happens. And in addition, when there are disturbances, what we have is really that we are looking at dissipation inequalities of the following type. V dot less or equal than minus rho of x plus gamma of D, where the crucial bit is that this energy balance that in the ISS classical theorem was between class K infinity function, this time has got rho, which is only positive definite. So it's a dissipation rate that could be, in a sense, much weaker than the one we have for ISS, which is instead required to be class K infinity. So here, all we care is that it's a tiny bit negative in x, let's say, but in fact, as x grows, it could even become smaller and smaller and fade to 0, okay? And this will give us a property of this kind, which is called integral input to state stability. By the way, this also shows that this Lyapunov function shows that integral ISS is a weaker property than ISS because of the Lyapunov characterization. This turns out is a Lyapunov characterization, and while from the definition was not obvious at all that this that a property like this would be implied perhaps by ISS. Okay, so this is then a Lyapunov-like characterization of integral input to state stability. This requires a dedicated proof. It doesn't follow from the results on ISS. It's a rather different way of proving the converse result, in fact. And so the following things which are equivalent, let me read them again. So the first one is the fact that the system is integral ISS, so fulfills the inequality that we've seen 2 slides ago with the energy of the input on the right-hand side. The other thing which is equivalent is the fact that there is an integral ISS Lyapunov function, so something that fulfills an inequality like this with a dissipation term which is only required to be positive definite. Still, it's quite important to have this separation between state, negative contribution, and input, positive stuff. And eventually, there's even perhaps an easier way to test the property. That is what we call a separation property somehow. So we just look at the system for 0 disturbances, and we make sure that with 0 disturbances we have global asymptotic stability. And then, in the presence of disturbances, we ask that V dot doesn't grow more than a class K infinity function of the disturbance. So in this case, we do not need to be particularly tight in the way we upper bound V dot. So the negative stuff somehow, if we lose it along the way, that's still okay, as long as we manage to make sure that the D-dependent stuff is of this form. So it's only D-dependent, is uniform with respect to X, so it's not amplified somehow by the magnitude of X in here. So that's what we want, that somehow there is a way to measure energy such that its rate of variation can only upper bounded by the size of the disturbance and independently of the size of state. Once you have this separation, zero gas and this type of behavior, you've got integral ISS. So I've got here an example of a little more complex system, let's say, which really kind of motivated the introduction of integral ISS. So this is a perhaps a manipulator, 2 degrees of freedom. It's a mechanical system. You could think of it evolving on a plane. There are 2 degrees of freedom, one angle, so it's free to rotate, and there is a mass that can somehow slide along this rotating arm. And you can write the equations, and then you've got 2 inputs essentially, a torque and a force to move the mass and to rotate this arm. You could perhaps take PD controllers, so input proportional to the speed of the corresponding degree of freedom and to the deviation with respect to some position of interest, some equilibrium of interest, okay? Which could be 0, of course, for instance. And then you could see this reference signal, this set point signal, the desired position, even as a input disturbance somehow. So this particular scheme is well known to achieve global asymptotic stability at not only at the origin, in fact, for theta d and rd equals 0, but at any equilibrium point, theta d, rd, 0, 0 for the corresponding speeds. So it is globally asymptotically stable for each constant values of set point. But one could ask, how about time varying? So if theta d and rd are time varying disturbances, what happens? And so it turns out that if they are looked at as disturbances rather than set points, you could get instability. So in fact, there are bounded input signals, such as this one, that result in unbounded solutions, at least in simulation. It's not easy to prove analytically that this system exhibits this kind of unstable solution. So these solutions are really designed by somehow trying to design a feedback U. This is the input. This input corresponds, sorry if I wasn't so clear, correspond maybe to this, okay? To this signal here is the input for this closed loop system. So this is some kind of nonlinear resonant behavior that may arise. So we're talking about a system which is globally asymptotically stable for 0 disturbance, but then a bounded disturbance, which is not periodic really, but it's kind of a oscillation. In fact, it's with slowly in frequency somehow that is able to destabilize it and create unbounded solutions. And the way this has been generated is by designing an extra loop, a destabilizing feedback loop, which is then saturated and still is able to destabilize the system. So we do not have essentially input to state stability, because here we've got bounded disturbances creating unbounded behaviors. So if you look at this system and from this in a state space description, these are the equations. You can, okay, close the loop with the PD controller that I was mentioning before, and you can use a Lyapunov function, for instance, the mechanical energy. The mechanical energy will have certain form, so speeds times inertia matrix plus the potential energy associated to the PD controllers that we are using. And when you take derivatives of this thing, for disturbances equal 0, it turns out that the mechanical energy is a Lyapunov function, but is a non-strict Lyapunov function, because in fact the dissipation term here is only proportional to the speed. So whenever you've got speed, you've got friction, and then you've got some decay in energy along the system solution. Now, that's good enough normally for stability of a system, autonomous, because you know there are these criteria that allow you to work under the relaxed assumption that your Lyapunov function should have negative semi-definite derivatives. So this is a derivative which is only 0 in certain direction, is only negative in certain directions, let's say in state space, whereas it's 0 in others. So when you add a disturbance, this looks like this. That's the inequality you can show. So this inequality is quite desirable because it separates the quadratic dissipation proportional to speed. There is, again, a quadratic or bilinear power injection in the system, and so the energy, with completion of squares, you can easily separate things and bring it to this form. And once you have it in this form, however, and you look at the ISS results, you cannot apply them because this is similar to ISS, but unfortunately, Z here, the variable Z here, is only the component Q dot, is not the whole state of your system. And so this is not in the form required for ISS. However, this is in the form required for integral ISS. In particular, if you like, we can use the separation property. So we can analyze the system for this thing equals 0, and then for this thing equals 0, we can easily apply the so-called Lassalle's criterion or stuff like that, that allow you to conclude global asymptotic stability only in the presence of a derivative which is negative semi-definite. And then you look at the disturbance different from 0. And the disturbance different from 0, all we needed is v dot less or equal than a class K infinity function of the disturbance, which is clearly the case here because this is non-negative. Sorry, this is negative or non-positive. And so we got the right inequality. And so we can apply the separation theorem for integral ISS to claim that indeed this system has at least an integral ISS property. All right. So these are some alternative formulations. And another thing I wanted to speak about, in fact, are now the so-called systems interconnections, because one of the interesting features of input to state stability are that properties of this kind can be used to study more complicated systems, somehow starting from the stability properties of its submodules. So this is, let's say, promoting a modular approach to stability, to the study of stability of systems. And so we would like perhaps to derive criteria for input to state stability of interconnected systems, so series, parallel, and feedback. And this is something that can be done very nicely in the input-output approach, and it's a classical result in the input-output approach that when you do series, that's fine, you still preserve the bounded input, bounded output stability. If you do parallel interconnections as well, you preserve the property. And if you do feedback interconnections, you have those results that go under the name of small gain theorems, which tell you that if somehow the loop gain is smaller than 1, then again, the stability property for the interconnected system are preserved. So this, in fact, is one of the main motivations for introducing this approach in the first place. And nicely enough, it can be extended to input to state stability. So again, if you've got two systems, two subsystems, let's say, x1 dot with input d1 and x2 dot with input d2. And as you assume basically that each of these subsystems is input to state stable with respect to the corresponding input signal, so D1 and D2. And then you establish a series interconnection. So in here, rather than taking the output, perhaps without loss of generality to a certain extent, really, we take the input D2 to be X1, and we just plug it in the next subsystem. And then we look at this overall system resulting from the series. And what is nice is that the same type of results that you have for linear systems, for instance, asymptotic stability of submodules is preserved where you interconnect linear systems in this way, because you get something block triangular. Same thing here. We get that input to state stability of individual subsystems is preserved. So the series interconnection is again input to state stable. Notice that the result would not be true instead if we were using global asymptotic stability. So if you use global asymptotic stability of individual subsystems in the absence of disturbances, that's not a property that is preserved under cascaded interconnection. This is because you don't really have any information about what goes on for disturbances, what goes on with the system when disturbances different from zero are applied. So you need some stronger notions to achieve this type of results. Parallel interconnections are really kind of trivial. Just by definition, essentially, whenever you plug in the same input to two systems, of course, if each one of those is input to state stable, then this state will be bounded by this input and a transient component. This state will be bounded by this input and a transient component, and overall the state of the system, the parallel system, will be bounded by a transient component plus something proportional to the input. So this is just really a matter of applying the definition. And when we look at feedbacks, instead, we know that even for linear systems, of course, we cannot expect results of the type, all right, you've got a stable system, another stable system, you connect them in feedback, then everything is going to again be stable. You cannot expect preservation of stability results. But what you can expect are results that tell you that if some notion of gain along the loop, the feedback loop that you have established is sufficiently small, then stability of individual modules is preserved. So that's the type of results that you would expect. This can be done in the input-output approach, as I said before, and can be done also in the ISS framework somehow. So what you need to do, you set up your equations for the interconnections, of course, and you look at the gains. The simplest form of gains are those for the max formulation. So if you take ISS in the max formulation here with gain gamma 1, where gain gamma 1 is the gain from input D1 to state X1, and gain gamma 2 is the gain from input D2 and state X2. So you look at this gain, then roughly speaking, really what the theorem tells you is that, well, if this is ISS, and in turn, when you compose the two gains, so gamma 1 of gamma 2 of R, this is strictly less than R for R different from 0, where trivially this cannot be fulfilled. For all positive R, then input to state stability holds. And there are even explicit expressions on what the final gains will look like from this extra input and this other input. So it's really quite handy. Once you've got these inequalities, you can really basically carry out some kind of calculations with inequalities so that you not only can establish new qualitative properties such as new ISS properties, but you You can also estimate the gains and things like that. There's fairly standard manipulations that you can do with class K infinity functions, class KL functions, in order to really get to the end and get a quantitative estimation of what your gain is going to look like. So this is much more insightful, I would say, than using epsilon delta type definitions, which really require a big concentration effort to understand what's going on. Whereas here you can process this, once you're familiar with them, you can process these gain functions or these KL functions that capture transients phenomena in a rather mechanical way and get to the end of it. And establishing again that your final function is again of class KL or is again of class K infinity is much easier than having to think in terms of epsilon delta. Epsilon delta has the concatenation of all these epsilon and deltas, resulted in something which is meaningful and which is of the form that I need. So, so this is a small gain theorem then, and so notice that as for linear systems, really, instead of having the product of gains here, we have the composition of gain function, and this is interesting. By the way, you could have here many subsystems evolving in a feedback loop, and again, you would have many gains here, pretty much like for linear systems. And it's also interesting, perhaps, to notice that while the notion of loop gain here is possibly dependent on where you start from in the loop, because gamma 1 of gamma 2 is in general different from gamma 2 of gamma 1, and so on. When you've got multiple systems, if you start from a certain subsystem, you will get a certain loop gain, let's say, when you move along the loop. So you do not necessarily have that this is a commutative expression, but still what is commutative instead is this inequality. So this inequality is fulfilled if and only if gamma 2 of R, of gamma 2 of gamma 1 of R is strictly less than R. So the notion of loop gain somehow is it's not intrinsic, it depends where you start from in the loop, but the notion of a small loop gain is intrinsic, and it doesn't depend on where you start from in the loop. All right, so now, as I promised before, input to state stability is just a start, really, to model many other systems theoretic properties related to stability, but also not so related to stability, at least not so much related to stability. So I've shown integral ISS. This is an extension in the direction of stability. I'm going to show now another extension in the direction of stability, but which has some interesting connections also to the ability of building estimators for the state of a system. So this concept is called incremental input to state stability. So it truly pushes at its maximum, I would say, the analogy between the behavior of a stable linear system and the behavior of a stable nonlinear system. So in fact, for a system, whenever you've got stability of the origin, because of linearity, you really have that stability of the origin is equivalent to stability of any other equilibrium point, or in fact of any other trajectory. So all trajectories of a system enjoy the same, of a linear system, enjoy the same stability properties, and that is also why we talk about stability of a system rather than stability maybe of an equilibrium. In particular, solutions not only approach the origin, but also approach each other, and not just a nominal behavior. All right, so one could ask for a similar property for nonlinear systems. So we call this incremental ISS. It's input to state stability still, because we also allow to have disturbances. And It's called incremental because instead of comparing our solutions to the zero solution, to the zero nominal solution, we're really looking at the distance between two different solutions, which correspond to different initial conditions and different input signals. And what we ask is that this difference, again, should be perhaps bounded by a transient term that decays to zero and should go down to zero as t goes to infinity and be proportional, quotation marks, okay, to the difference of initial condition plus some other term, because we might not be applying the same input to the two systems. So eventually, those two systems could still have behaviors which are different, but their distance should be somehow, again, proportional in the sense of k-infinity functions to the norm of the difference between the two inputs applied. So this is something that is, again, a trivial consequence of stability for linear systems, because whenever you have a solution and you have another solution for a linear system, this difference is nothing but the solution corresponding to the difference of initial condition and the difference of disturbances. And so it can be bounded like this if you've got stability, okay? But for nonlinear systems, it's generally something more than that. For instance, it implies that if you apply the same disturbance, and this is zero then the two solutions should go down to zero. Their distance should go down to zero, which means that essentially the system should forget past initial conditions in the very sense that a linear system does. So whenever you've got some kind of persistent excitation acting on it, then the system will perhaps converge to some kind of steady state behavior corresponding to this excitation. And this steady state behavior will be independent of initial conditions. So you cannot expect that for an ISS system. Definitely not for a general nonlinear system, but even for an ISS system, despite the fact that it's bounded to stay in a neighborhood of the origin, which is proportional to the size of the input perturbation, can have behaviors which in fact are dependent on the initial conditions. So in general, could, for instance, have, I don't know, a single equilibrium for d equals 0, but multiple equilibria for d different from 0 and constant maybe, and this equilibria could have different bases of attraction so that you end up in one or the other depending where you start from. And so you never truly forget the initial condition in the sense that this property is asking. All right. So this is a very strong requirement. In a sense, is what could be seen as a notion of open loop observability. So open loop observability means that, well, if you've got a system that you don't know the state of, maybe the first one, how can I estimate the state of the system? Just send the same disturbance to it, just send it the same input, and eventually their states will converge to one another. So this is open loop observability. So a stable linear system, the state of a stable linear system can be simply be estimated by sending the same input. Of course, if you also can measure the output of your system, you can do better. So you can design output injections that stabilize even unstable systems and be able to observe their behavior. And so you can do perhaps with nonlinear systems. So you could stabilize them by output injection, make sure that you get some incremental ISS type of property so that you would then be able to observe it. So incremental ISS is a very interesting property because it's not only related to stability, but also, if you like, to observability of the system in a sense, and to the ability of design estimators to it. And it has other implications. I'm just mentioning here some of them. For instance, periodic input signals result in asymptotically periodic state responses, as for linear systems, except that if you act on a single harmonic here, you will not go to a single harmonic. So the number of harmonics does not fulfill the same constraints of a linear system, that each harmonic really translate into, each input harmonic translate into a single output harmonic. Here it's all coupled, But periodicity implies periodicity, and almost periodicity implies almost periodicity, and stuff like that. So there's quite a lot of very interesting behavior that happen. And how about this property? So it turns out that this property can also be studied with Lyapunov functions, and in particular, incremental Lyapunov functions. So what you need to do is you need to extend your state, including two copies of the system. So essentially, you define an extended state space x1, x2, and you look at the diagonal in this particular state space. So the set where x1 is equal to x2. So it turns out that you can define the point to set distance of a stack x1, x2 to this particular diagonal as follows. So you take the minimum of z in the diagonal of z minus x1, x2, and this point to set distance is in fact proportional to the distance between x1 minus x2 norm. So then if you look at the auxiliary system here, which is is there a problem?
Yeah, I think the sound just broke up just for the last.
Did I click something?
Just for the last 5 or 10 seconds, I think.
Okay. Let me go back. So let me repeat. So essentially, we have two copies of the system, which we look at as a single system, essentially. So with extended state space, x1, x2. And what we are asking is for this extended system to have an ISS property, not with respect to the usual norm, so not the usual distance to the origin.
Yeah, I think it's frozen again. I'm not sure. It seems to be a problem with this particular line of the equations. As soon as you get to it, it stops working.
I don't know. That's funny. Yeah. So we are really asking that this type of inequality holds, which is an ISS type of inequality where we are measuring, however, distance to the diagonal rather than to the origin. And here is okay, the distance between inputs. So one can essentially, using Lyapunov function technique, then use similar inequalities as the one used for standard ISS. All the theory of ISS, in fact, can be extended to sets rather than single points. And so when you have the diagonal delta as a set, you can perhaps ask that your function v x1, x2 should be lower and upper bounded by 2k infinity functions of the norm of the distance to the diagonal, which would be x1 minus x2, this absolute value or norm, let's say, less or equal than alpha 2 of the norm of x1 minus x2 again. So that's the usual thing, saying that our v is 0 on the diagonal. It grows radially unbounded away from the diagonal, essentially. And this is how you compute the derivative of your incremental Lyapunov function. So you do dv dx1 times the first part plus dv dx2 times f x2 d2. And then what you want to see and to show is that this is less or equal than minus a class k infinity function of the difference x1 minus x2 plus a class k infinity function of d1 minus d2. So if you can prove this inequality, then you would have also incremental ISS. Again, for linear system, this is perfectly fine with quadratic Lyapunov functions here, where v of x1, x2 has the form x1 minus x2 transpose P times x1 minus x2. So you really take a quadratic expression in x1 minus x2. In general here, notice that we need functions which are both a function of x1 and x2, not just a function of x1 minus x2. This is related to the fact that it's not true that the difference of solutions is just another solution for a linear system. So for a nonlinear system, so there isn't such kind of shift invariance sort of property that allows us to bring everything back to the origin somehow, to x1 minus x2, so to an r-dimensional state space. We have to really work in 2r, and so have a dependence which is both with respect to x1 and x2. Again, this is the result, finding this Lyapunov function in an augmented state space. That's even harder, and I've lost a bit of the connection. All right.
It was only for 1 second.
I'm back. Okay. So this is now introducing how really to move from input to state stability to what we could call X to Y stability. So input to state stability is really just the beginning of a taxonomy of similar properties that can be formulated. So we could replace I and S with other stuff. So for instance, one could replace S with output and try to formulate input to output stability. Or one could replace I with output and look at output to state stability. Now, this is perhaps kind of an obvious step because we're still talking about input to output stability. This is a less obvious step. We're talking about output to state stability. So we're talking about bounding the state of a system in terms of its output rather than its input. So this corresponds, for those of you familiar with linear systems theory, finite dimensional systems theory, could correspond to notions of detectability of a system. Although the notion of detectability for linear systems is really normally introduced by looking at, for instance, Kalman decompositions, looking at observable and unobservable subsystems and so on, making sure that unobservable stuff is stable on its own. It turns out that one of the consequences of this quite technical definitions, I would say, and quite, well, geometric in spirit, they really use and capture all the power of linear systems theory, is that one of the consequences that this concept can also imply, and in fact are equivalent for linear systems, to bounds on the state expressed in terms of the output. So this is a way to define detectability for nonlinear systems, which does not need a lot of geometry, and so it's much to have a handle upon, to put your hands on, let's say, because it can just be introduced by using certain types of inequalities rather than maybe decompositions and so on, which requires maybe notions of manifolds and stuff like that, which is much harder to observable, unobservable decomposition, which are much harder to state and definitely to prove, especially in a global setup. Here we're talking about stuff can be done globally, in fact. So another replacement, which is quite natural, is input-output to state stability. So you could ask bounds that hold. So you could bound the state in terms of inputs and outputs. Or there's even more exotic stuff like output to input stability. which is really something related to what is known as minimum phase properties for linear systems, so stabilities of the zeros of a transfer function for a linear system. Now, so many of these things can be characterized or studied at least using Lyapunov function. So I will present just output to state stability in this direction, but in fact input output to state stability has also been characterized. And so for instance, you could take a system of the following form: x dot equal f of x, y equal h of x, and decide that this system, you want to call it output to state stable if it fulfills this particular inequality. So the solution at time t from initial condition x0 is upper bounded by some kind of transient term, which is a function of initial condition, but eventually you want to be able to bound everything in terms of the norm of the output that you have observed between time 0 and time t. So this is formally equivalent to input to state stability, except that we've replaced the disturbance d here with the output of our system. And also then the corresponding notion of Lyapunov function, v of x, the so-called OSS Lyapunov function, is really formally equivalent. And it's again a function v of x, which is positive definite and radially unbounded. So, and fulfilling something like this, so v dot is less or equal than a class k infinity function of x plus a class k infinity function of the output, so of h of x, of your output function. Now, the interesting bit is that indeed this property and this Lyapunov characterization are equivalent, and so exactly the same theorem that holds for input to state stability holds for output to state stability. So they are equivalent, but the proof are not the same. At least one direction of the proof perhaps is the same, but the converse is definitely not the same, okay? Because the output is not the input of a system, so it plays a different role. You cannot do things with it that you will be doing with the input. So it's quite interesting to see that this extends. And input output to state stability, again, same thing. So if you allow here to have disturbances, and you allow this bound here to also have disturbances on the right-hand side, you would have a similar Lyapunov characterization where all that changes is here the possibility of having disturbances. So it truly gives you now a taxonomy where you can start playing around and formulating a lot of interesting systems theoretic concepts using this type of inequalities and comparison functions. And again, you can then have lots of characterizations. For instance, all the theorems, the so-called everything is ISS theorem, as soon as you try to formulate detectability concepts, you can basically generalize all those theorems to the context of systems with inputs and output and prove that everything is input-output to state stability when you try to look at detectability notions. And again, even there, you can say not quite, and perhaps you may want to look at integral versions of the property, so integral I OSS and so on. So it gives you really a freedom to characterize lots of properties related to stability, but not also so much related to it, and find system theoretic characterization. So this is the conclusion of the first part. So just to recap what we've seen, I've introduced input to state stability, shown how it bridges Lyapunov and input-output stability approaches, classical. It really allows to establish implications and equivalences between lots of so-called stable behaviors or results of the type everything is ISS. We've got Lyapunov-like characterizations, which of course are very important to be able to study these properties in actual examples. And it allows us to introduce really a taxonomy of systems theoretic properties just by replacing input and states with other signals relevant to the system's behavior, and try all sorts of different combinations. If you try them, many of them will have interesting meaning. At least you could see it for linear systems, and then that motivate very often equivalent to an important linear system property, and that can give you inspiration then to really look at a nonlinear property and see how to characterize it. And extensions that I could be talking next if there's enough time. It's about, in fact, complex systems, the one I will be talking about. So systems with dynamics which, in the absence of disturbances, are more complicated than just equilibrium. This is also an interesting topic, because so far we really have looked at a property that for disturbances equal to zero is essentially global asymptotic stability at the origin, whereas we would like perhaps to have a nominal behavior which is more complicated. So that's it. That's what the next part could be about. Are there any questions? Okay. If not, perhaps I could transition to my other slides. I still have 20-something minutes. This is slightly more advanced material. Let me see. Is it working? Okay.
I can still see the old slides, I think.
The old ones? That's funny. I see the new ones. Let me stop sharing.
Stop sharing and start again.
Yeah. I stopped sharing. I know what the problem is, because I'm not sharing the screen, but I'm sharing a window, so the window hasn't. Yeah. So this is
just coming up, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see this. Yeah.
Okay.
Cool. Yeah.
So I can. I don't see it very well now. For some reason, it doesn't show it to me in full screen.
Right. I can see it on my end. I can see it in full screen fine.
So I'll try to go full screen now. Can you still see it?
Yeah, it looks good. It's good.
Okay, I don't see your window, but I've seen the presentation full screen at least. Okay, so this is well, a lot of the slides I'll go through quite fast because they are introductory in spirit, but so just as an extra motivation, of course, I would like basically to extend the theory of ISS to include lots of familiar behaviors and face portraits maybe that we know of, but they do not fall in the class of globally asymptotically stable systems. So perhaps I'd like to study stability of oscillators, like, I don't know, van der Pol oscillator maybe, with this type of phase portrait. Of course, there is asymptotically stable limit cycle, and there is an unstable equilibrium in the middle. But then many other systems that have been working on in the past that involve, for instance, some kind of multi-stability. Multi-stability, it could be a situation where you could have multiple equilibria, some of which could be stable, like here you've got these spirals converging to focuses, or some could be unstable, like there is a saddle, there's clearly a saddle point in the phase portrait in the middle. And I still would like to study robustness of these nominal behaviors, so to speak, with respect to disturbances. Other behaviors could include global stability, for instance, a pendulum. A pendulum converts to downwards equilibrium, of course, for almost all initial conditions. For some initial conditions, it might converge to the upwards equilibrium, which is in fact a saddle point. And again, this is an interesting property, and we could ask ourselves what happens if we are forcing this now with a disturbance? Do we retain some kind of stability? So there's many applications where this type of dynamics are of interest, of course. And so this would be the outline. I will, in particular, describe two possible extensions, the so-called global attractivity versus the almost global stability.
David, sorry, can I just ask you? On my screen, I'm still seeing the cover slide to your talk. I don't know if you
really. I switched to to another slide.
Yeah, I was just checking because I don't know if it's worth trying to share it again. I'm not sure if that's the case for anyone else, but
I was going to raise this.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. So somehow I'm not sharing anymore. Let's see. Or let's see if I go back here. Okay, here I'm still on the first slide here. Okay, so unfortunately I have to be here. Okay, so as I was saying, these are the phase portrait of one dipole oscillator with an equilibrium, multi-stable system, multiple focuses and saddle point, almost global stability like this. So a pendulum, there is a almost globally asymptotically stable equilibrium, but there is also a saddle point, which is attracting just a tiny bit of inertial condition. And we would like to have stability with respect to disturbances for these classes of systems. So I will discuss two approaches, in particular global attractivity versus almost global stability approach, and try maybe to provide some Lyapunov characterization. So let me start from, this comparison function will be useful also in this context, but, and this is the intuitive meaning of ISS. This is just recapping the results that we've seen so far, Lyapunov characterizations of the property. And I will, in particular, insist on this characterization, which will be useful for extending the notion, the so-called asymptotic gain. Asymptotic gain is equivalent to input to state stability under very mild assumption, like Lyapunov stability of in the absence of disturbances of the zero equilibrium. So now we look at this more general dynamics, and this is like a pendulum or a van der Pol oscillator. And of course, in here, together with the stable behavior, somehow we also have unstable behaviors. Okay, so let me see if this, we've got here a saddle point, which is an unstable situation, okay? Whereas we've got here an unstable focus inside the oscillator. So what kind of alternative approaches do we have? One approach would be to study stability by fattening up the terminal set. So we would replace the normal, so the distance to the origin, with a point to set to some set. Unfortunately, take the set of attractors of the systems, because this set is not stable in the Lyapunov sense. So we would have to fatten it up. So for instance, for the van der Pol oscillator, we would have to take to this terminal set. This is not very satisfactory because it introduces somehow a discontinuity between the information that we get for d equals 0, which is we know that.
Hi, David. Sorry, we keep losing the sound. I don't know if it's worth sort of closing the document, starting again or something.
Is it not working?
Yeah, it's just every now and again the sound cuts out for some reason. I don't know whether it's your connection or something. It's fine
maybe
now.
My connection is a bit weak.
So you might want to deactivate the camera. That normally helps on the video feed.
Oh yeah, that's a good idea.
To do what?
Switch off camera, so the sound normally gets better. Yeah, the camera is sucking all the bandwidth.
Okay, so this is So one possibility is to fatten up the terminal set, but this is not very desirable because it introduces some kind of discontinuity between d equals 0 and d different from 0. In that, for d equals 0, we know we are either at the periodic solution asymptotically or at the equilibrium, whereas for d different from 0, we would know that we are essentially in a neighborhood of a much bigger set, okay, this fattened up set. So what are alternative approaches? Well, we could perhaps ask that we've got some kind of almost global ISS. So we could look at the asymptotically stable attractors of these dynamics, omega limit sets, and just relax global to almost global. So insist that almost all solution will converge to the asymptotically stable omega limit sets, and in fact to a neighborhood of them proportionally to the disturbance when disturbances are applied. Or we could, in fact, perhaps sacrifice the idea of having stability. So we could consider the union of all omega limit sets, both the stable and unstable ones, like we had in the pendulum example or in the oscillators example, and then ask that for all solutions, we are going to converge to a neighborhood of those omega limit sets. So we would basically formulate some kind of global asymptotic gain property, but giving up the requirement that we are dealing with a Lyapunov stable set. It turns out that this latest approach is, in fact, the most, let's say, aligned with the ISS theory, as we have presented before. So the classical approach to input to state stability. Even though we are somehow giving up Lyapunov stability, we could truly define ISS as the asymptotic gain property with respect to the distance to the set W that contains all the attractors, all the omega limit sets of the nominal dynamics for d equals 0. And under fairly mild assumptions on W, now we all know that this is attractivity, okay, for d equals 0. We all know that attractivity in itself is not enough to have nice Lyapunov characterizations of the property, because you could have behaviors such as homoclinic orbits or stuff like that, that essentially destroy Lyapunov stability and also, in fact, prevent the existence of Lyapunov functions. But if your dynamics are sufficiently benign so they do not have this type of cycles, homoclinic cycles, heteroclinic cycles, then, in fact, attractivity is enough to conclude global asymptotic stability and to claim existence, if you've got a single equilibrium, and to claim existence of Lyapunov functions, effectively. So that turns out is the approach that one may want to follow if one is really trying to recover as many of the results of classical input to state stability. So in particular, there is this Lyapunov characterization, which was found quite recently, 2015, of input to state stability with respect to complex dynamics. So we've got here a set, that W, that includes all omega limit sets of the nominal dynamics, and the characterization is, in fact, that there should exist V of x such that it's lower bounded by a k infinity function of the distance to this set W, and such that V dot fulfills precisely the same type of dissipation inequality that you would expect for classical ISS. So minus alpha of distance to W, so plus k infinity function, plus gamma of the size of input disturbances. So notice here that this theorem is basically the same as before, except that we do not have the upper bound. So the upper bound here is not a good idea in this context, because we do not have Lyapunov stability. So if we put an upper bound of this 4, we are essentially forcing the Lyapunov function to be 0 a minimum at the set W, whenever we are on W. So all points of W sit on the minimum of this function. And that is only compatible with Lyapunov stability, whereas in our case, W is not a Lyapunov stable set. So we want some parts of W to be allowed to have energy higher than 0. Other parts of W are fine because they are asymptotically stable, and we would be happy with them being 0 there. But for instance, in the pendulum, the upright equilibrium, we definitely do not want it to have 0 energy if we are saying that 0 energy is at the downwards position. So, and the results is an if and only if, and it took really at least 20 years to move from the result from standard equilibria, from standard ISS for systems with equilibria to this particular result, which essentially the statement is just erasing a k function from the statement of the previous theorem. So why did it take 20 years to realize that this theorem was actually true? And first thing is that we, in some sense, we took the wrong direction. So we went in the direction of looking at almost global stability properties rather than global but relaxing Lyapunov stability. So we did not relax Lyapunov stability. The result is sort of new, even for autonomous systems. I wouldn't really say it's new. It's a classical result, except that for technical reasons it was stated for autonomous systems, was stated only for compact manifolds. So is known for compact manifolds that under certain assumptions you've got Lyapunov functions. I haven't really stated what these assumptions are. I have only said we are talking about absence of cycles in a specific sense. So this absence of cycles is a technical assumption which is very important, which allows in the autonomous case to recover a converse Lyapunov theorem. But in fact, the result is somehow non-trivial in both directions, I would say. So while it's obvious normally that if you've got a Lyapunov dissipation inequality, then you can prove a certain inequality on the solutions. In here, the result is not so obvious. So even the fact that a Lyapunov function of this type could be used to prove the bound we are talking about, an asymptotic gain property, is non-obvious because somehow here there isn't a good match between the sublevel sets of V and the way the dissipation looks like. So the sublevel sets of V do not necessarily look like the set W in a certain sense, and in particular it is the proof does not rely on invariance, on notion of forward invariance alone. There's a mix of forward invariance and some kind of completeness of continuity, the arguments that need to be used in order to prove a bound of that type. So even the forward implication is not straightforward. So this is then the wrong direction. The wrong direction is what I said is the almost global asymptotic stability. It's wrong in the sense that it does not afford simple Lyapunov-like characterization. So you could want to have almost global asymptotic stability. This cannot be formulated simply using comparison functions for almost all initial conditions, because whenever you're near an unstable equilibrium, you get a stickiness effect that does not lend itself to a uniform transient. So you cannot use uniform transient any longer if you go to almost global asymptotic stability. So you would have any way to resort to asymptotic attractivity properties for almost all initial conditions. So cannot use this type of formulation. And then the ISS in an almost global setup is something of this form. It's quite tricky to state. So for all disturbances, there exists a bad set of initial conditions of zero measure, such that if your initial condition is not in the bad set, this is your state space, and this is the bad set, then you've got asymptotic gain property. So it turns out that this property can somehow be characterized using quite interesting conditions that go under the name of dual Lyapunov functions. There is no time, I think, for looking at this now. It would be really a stretch, but there are ways to do it, at least to prove this type of implications, but they are not necessary and sufficient conditions, and they require quite tricky concepts to be worked out. So notice that here we want really the bed set to be allowed to depend on the disturbance, and this is quite crucial because in all actual examples, essentially, the disturbance is really sending your state around, and you cannot expect that the set of bad initial condition is the same for all input disturbances. So this is just a simple example, the simplest possible example for which perhaps you have an almost global input to state stability property is defined on a manifold. So there is also the possibility of extending these techniques to manifolds now, since we are not looking at global asymptotic stability. If you look at theta as being the angle, this is perhaps the simplest almost global asymptotically stable system. Theta dot equal minus sine theta, so there is a almost globally asymptotically stable equilibrium at theta 0, whereas theta equal pi is unstable. And this is for d equals 0. When you put disturbances, that shifts a little bit to the left or to the right your equilibrium. And if the disturbance is constant, this is not a big deal because you really have almost global asymptotic stability to the down here. But if you start time varying, if you have time varying these, there's really a chance that you might trap some solutions in a neighborhood of the unstable equilibrium here. And so you do not have that almost all solution will converge to the stable one down there or to a neighborhood of the stable one. So what one can use is measure theoretic argument to prove that the volume of solutions that can do this is in fact 0. So this type of pathological behavior only happens at most for zero measure sets of initial conditions. And so using these dual Lyapunov techniques allows to essentially recover this type of stability results. So yeah, so I really have to skip all of this. There would be an example of a pendulum showing that this is indeed both almost input to state stable and globally input to state stable in the sense of the attractivity definition. So this gives some nice complementarity of properties. So we can claim that all solutions will converge to a neighborhood either of the downright equilibrium or the upright one, but almost all, in fact, will converge to a neighborhood of the downwards position. So we really characterize the stability behavior of a system like this. And same thing for the van der Pol oscillator. One could prove things of the sort. Almost all solution will converge to the periodic solution or to a neighborhood of it. But in fact, all of it will converge to a neighborhood of the periodic solution and the unstable focus which sits in the middle. So that's all I wanted to say. There's just here, I was also going to mention the technical condition, which is crucial, is that there are no cycles. And this is something that can be captured from looking at a phase portrait in the absence of disturbances and associating a graph, and that graph, which mimics in a somewhat symbolic way what the dynamics of the system look like, should not have cycles, and that's a crucial assumption that is needed. So that's all really. This is just ISS for complex systems. Of course, there's a lot open also here. You would like maybe to extend to X to Y stability for complex system, although this looks quite challenging, but it's a potential research direction. That's all. Yes. Thanks for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, David. Really nice talks, especially at the end on some new directions that possibly can be taken. Are there any questions from any of the ESRs on any of the material that we've seen in the last few hours? I'm not seeing anything at the moment. I guess it's at the end of the 2 weeks of lectures. It's been a bit much. I suppose you mentioned, I just had one thought, one of the possible extensions being infinite dimensional systems, which yes. I guess I know a lot of the researchers listening today be working kind of mainly with PDEs, for example. And I suppose when you're looking at in the infinite dimensional case, you're often worried about characterizing the regularity of your state or your solution, whether it's sufficiently differentiable for the solution to exist, or maybe trying to characterize what function space the solution lives in, depending on the disturbance or depending on the input. I mean, do these extensions of input to state stability enable you to get a better handle on that for nonlinear systems? Yeah,
I wouldn't expect ISS to give you a better handle maybe on that necessarily. I don't know. I'm not very familiar with the infinite dimensional theory, but normally the thing is, once you've established the existence of solutions, then perhaps you can try to find bounds of this that this solution fulfills as a function of what the disturbance looked like and so on. And so, for instance, I know there is quite a bit of research going on for time delay systems, and there, for instance, the state itself would be maybe an interval of your solution. And then, for instance, you would want to ask yourself, what kind of dissipation inequality do I need? Do I need the positive definite function of the norm of the state, or is it enough x at current time, for instance, or things like that, which would be much easier perhaps to prove, because getting these strict inequalities when the state is such a complex object, infinite dimensional object, might be challenging. So as far as I know, the question is probably still open, whether you can really aim at a relaxed form of Lyapunov inequality. I know there were people looking at this. I don't know, maybe I'm not very up to date, but there is a lot that can be definitely done, I would say, for nonlinear systems in the infinite dimensional case. Yes.
Sure. Yeah. I remember seeing something by one of the groups in Oxford that were trying to apply this sort of ideas to some more complicated fluid flows. And I suppose they probably were assuming some amount of regularity and trying to prove bounds. But I've certainly seen this applied in the infinite dimensional setting, which I think is an interesting path to take going forward.
Yes. Yeah, I would like to jump upon what Andy was saying, actually.
Sure.
Yeah, because I think that, from what I know in the PD setting, which is not too much, but still something, at least for Navier-Stokes, when they study stability, there's a thing which is quite popular for nonlinear PDs, which is called invariant manifold theory. And in fact, after a lot of technical computations and all of these kinds of things, they try to look, at least in some local sense, to look at the system as a finite dimensional system. So in the end, I think something which I don't have too much knowledge about, and I would like to ask, is, at least in the finite dimensional context, which you presented here, how would you explain this invariant manifold theory, and whether this is really linked to this input to state stability you presented?
Okay, so we could so these results that you mentioned for PDEs could definitely be of interest to reduce the system, the study of stability of PDEs, to the study of finite dimensional manifolds, and the theory of ISS now has been extended to be formulated to these particular types of manifolds. So definitely, so the latest results that I've shown apply really to manifolds. We are looking at manifolds without boundary, and the emphasis is still pretty much on having global properties on these manifolds. So that's what we have. Concerning invariant manifold theory, sometimes for finite dimensional systems, you look at, for instance, linearizations, and you look at linearizations and then linearization around an equilibrium, you've got maybe hyperbolic equilibrium, and then if all the eigenvalues are on the left, then you've got stability. If you don't, if you've got eigenvalues also on the right, you've got instability. And if you've got eigenvalues on the imaginary axis, then you can try to build there an invariant manifold and go on studying that invariant manifold and its stability. Normally, these approaches are done in a local way, again, because there. So you know that there is this invariant manifold, but it's hard perhaps to characterize what the dynamics is going to be far away from the equilibrium, because it will take an expansion that's probably endless, and so you don't really get a good handle of what things look like far away from the equilibrium, but they allow you to extend conditions for stability using somehow linearization techniques in a nonlinear setup. So I would say that the spirit of input to state stability is somehow not so much going in the direction of looking at manifolds, because that entails geometry and entails a lot with very complicated notions somehow that are very hard to handle in a global setup. So a lot of this theory then is really trying to bypass having to deal with manifolds. And so we try to work with analysis tools like Lyapunov functions rather than geometric tools. That, of course, as I said, whereas, for instance, the almost global ISS approach deals also with geometry somehow, because when I've got unstable equilibrium, for instance, for a pendulum, I want to characterize how many solutions converge to the unstable equilibrium. And then I look there at the invariant manifold and use those tools for extending the theory to that particular setup. But as I said, I don't regard this approach as being the one that is more aligned with the philosophy of ISS. That was somewhat complementary to ISS. It gives very interesting information, very subtle information, measure theoretic things, such as for almost all initial conditions, you go down with the pendulum and you don't go up with the pendulum. It's a very subtle thing to prove, but you don't have if and only if conditions. You don't have all the types of equivalences that you could get with the global approach of ISS. That really goes then into establishing a global property. You don't need hyperbolicity, nothing like that is needed. For instance, if gravity is weird enough that, or the shape of the pendulum, I don't know, is weird enough that for some reason the saddle is no longer hyperbolic and the basis of attraction fattens up, becomes non-zero measure because of the funny way disturbance enter your system, you will still be able to draw a conclusion with that particular approach, whereas this invariant manifold approach is more reliant on hyperbolicity and proving that unstable manifolds have zero measure, and or stable manifold has zero measure for an unstable equilibrium and things like that. So it is a complementary set of tools, but I think the most innovative results, perhaps, that to state stability I've brought are in looking at global situations and in a nonlinear setup, allowing inputs. That's what they do without the need for geometric insight necessarily.
Yes, so I mean, I was also asking the question because there's another one which I wanted to ask. So yes. Your results tell you more or less what is the rate of convergence of a dynamical system to an equilibrium, right? But this, in some sense, tells you only the first order behavior in some sense, because it only tells you the, I wouldn't say linear, but it's really just the first order expansion. But sometimes, at least I know that in PDEs, in partial differential equations, we're interested in also having an asymptotic expansion of higher order rates. So not only first order behavior, but second order, third order, which is linked to this I think in physics, sometimes they call this metastability. So in an intermediate time, you have some explicit behavior, and then when time gets very large, you really get close to the equilibrium, and the equilibrium is the leading order term. So I wanted to know whether this input to state stability also applies to obtaining higher order expansions in some sense.
Okay, so, well, I wasn't familiar with this idea of metastability that you talked about, but for what I could understand from your question is that you're talking about the rate of stability changing in time, depending how big the state is or things like that. Yeah. So that is definitely possible in input to state stability in the sense that we do not prescribe any specific type of rates. And when you got Lyapunov inequality, that doesn't need to come and as in a particular form or shape, in a linear form or shape. So indeed, for instance, you could have v of x that goes down less or equal than minus v, let's say. So that will tell you that v of x of t is less or equal to exponential minus t of v of x of 0. But in terms of state, in fact, the v of x could have a very funny shape because it's upper and lower bounded from alpha 1 and alpha 2 of t. And so that will, in fact, could modulate how your rates change with the size of x, okay? Because alpha 1 or alpha 2 could go faster or slower to infinity, depending on how big is x. All that matters is that they go up to infinity. So there isn't, it's not a local notion, and it's able to capture different speed of convergence for different values of the state. I have to say that these aspects are more related to the quantitative behaviors that you can infer out of this dissipation inequalities. A lot of the theory has been really concerned with the qualitative type of behavior, but definitely because the notion is qualitative, it allows a lot of different quantitative behaviors which are compatible with this qualitative behavior. So indeed, multiple rates of convergence for different size of states are all captured, let's say, by the notion.
Thank you so much.